Happy New Year and welcome to episode number 17 of We're Just Talking About It. In this episode, Jason talks about how he got the idea for his next possible book. The idea behind this book is to talk about some of the toughest questions Jason gets asked and answer them. Anything from what's the deal with those 72 virgins to why do all Muslims hate us? And we're going to answer some of those right now.
Right before I left DC, I sat down with a gentleman who's the president of a nonprofit organization. I went to K Street, which is always an interesting place to go in DC. I found the end of K Street, and I took a picture of it, because if you know anything about K Street in DC, that's where all the lobbyists work. And they set up these nonprofit organizations. They all have an educational mission, but they're all lobbyists for some cause or another. So this particular building was on the end of K Street, which I'd never seen before. I assumed it went on forever because there's just so many lobbyists in America. So I took a picture of it. Unfortunately, there is construction at the end of it, so they're building on. There will be more lobbyists. But this guy actually truly has an educational mission, and I just said, I'm going to be in DC. Can we sit down for 20 minutes? I've heard about your organization. They do kind of what I'm doing. They do it overseas. They go a lot in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and they try to work on, using religion as a diplomatic tool and looking for religious tolerance and trying to help people who want to improve religious tolerance. And these are in Muslim majority countries. He said, sure, that's great. We sit down, and what was going to be a 20-minute conversation turns into a 2.5-hour meeting. Luckily, he had nothing on his calendar. We were both stunned by what each other's missions were. And we're just talking back and forth. And then he said, what you're doing in America, we'd like to get involved in America because we do it overseas, but you're trying to build bridges here and increase religious tolerance in America. We'd like to move into that zone, but how do you do it? How do you do these talks? That's the part that I don't think anybody's mastered. He said, it sounds like you're actually getting somewhere somehow without funding, without an organizational background. You just as a person out there doing this, what's your methodology? How do you do that? So he asked me to write a book. And we're going to try to write a book in the next year and get it published so that other people can see how I do the talks. And then the normal questions I get asked. So we've come up with this long list of questions, and we talked about a couple of them today, but we're trying to get 75, 100 questions that I normally get in a discussion, and then write the simple answer that I give. So it's kind of a primer for non-Muslims that want to learn more about it or want to lead a group discussion on it and do more research, but just have the basic questions and the basic answers. Because if you're trying to educate people, that's what you need to know. And I usually travel with little PowerPoint slides, and I use some maps and some graphics and some phrases that help people understand what I'm saying. All of my slides are built on questions I've been asked. For 3.5 years, I've written down the questions, and I make sure there's a slide a word, a phrase, a picture, a map that helps answer that question. And so I'm basically going to take my talk and put it into a book.
All right, so let's take a look at some of the questions you could be answering in your next book. Some of these questions can be pretty raw, so we apologize in advance if any of these offend you. But let's get started with one that you hear quite a bit, which is, why do Muslims hate us?
Yeah, again, I don't think it's a question. None of these questions that I listed in here do I really think. One or two instances, there's probably a question in there that was really asked out of hatred. Most of the time, it's asked out of ignorance. So I don't think it's bigotry that asks these questions. I think they're honest questions. It's only bigotry if you're doing it because you're hateful about it.
Right.
But most of these are just, hey, all right, guy, you know a little bit about Islam. Well, why don't you explain this to me? Because I can't get it. And I think that's an important one. A lot of people in America feel like, because of what they see on the news, that all Muslims must hate us. I get that question a lot when I talk about Afghanistan. Well, why do all those Afghans hate us? Why are we still at war with the Afghans? I'm like, we're not at war with the Afghans. We are helping the Afghan government to secure their country so that 30 million people can have safety and security. And they are Afghans that we are partners with. And they're Muslims. So this is a good way to answer the question. They don't all hate us. They were happy we helped them get rid of the Taliban because they didn't like the Taliban. They're happy that we're helping to train them, but we're not trying to invade their country and take it over. We don't control any part of the government. We are literally there just to assist them. And most Muslims in the world, whether in America or outside, feel the same. We're happy if you want to be our friend and you want to be our partner. We are not happy with you if you want to take over our country or change our country in some dramatic way, unless it's a case like Afghanistan, where the Afghans were quite happy to see the Taliban gone. That was bringing back freedom for them. So I think that's the easiest way to look at it. You only see one side of the argument, and it looks like they're angry, but there's only 20 guys burning flags in that city that day, American flags, and yelling death to America. And they were paid to go out there by some regime or political party, or if it's Iran, there might be a few thousand that show up because they can force them to go out there and burn flags and chant death to America. But the average person could give a flip less about America, and certainly doesn't have hate for us. They would love to be our friend.
Yeah.
And I see that all the time when I travel in the Middle East or talk to Muslims in America. They're trying to figure out, how do I get past this divide that's between us that shouldn't be there? Because I'm a nice person and I have a nice family, and I think you must too, and I just want to talk to you.
Like Munim Dean, in one of our previous episodes, one of our guests just said, at the end of the day, you're just talking to another human.
Yeah, I wanted to include those questions because I think if you can't answer those up front, you can't explain Islam to somebody, because that's where people are, which is why I started talking in the first place. This long after September 11th, we still know so little about this religion that's had such a big impact on our lives. And Muslims feel like, our religion's been hijacked by these very violent people who are portraying who we are, and that's not who we are. So they're struggling to take it back. But I watch Muslims interact with non-Muslims, and if they got a question like that, instead of answering it, they would just, sometimes they just ball up because it's offensive.
Right.
I would too if you asked me that about Baptists. But if you ball up and just say, look, Islam's a religion of peace, next question, you didn't answer the question. They're still wondering, but why is there so much violence associated with, with Islam in some way or another? Either it's happening in Muslim countries, or when it happens here, somehow Islam pops up to be some kind of motivation. Like, what's the linkage? That's the real question, is where does this linkage between violence and religion happen? And you've got to be able to explain that.
Can you start with that one? You want to be able to try to explain that maybe in the shorter version? Let's start with that. So, why do non-Muslims view Islam as so violent?
I think for non-Muslims, if you watch the news and you see some violence happening, what just happened in Australia, a guy gets out, lights a car on fire, tries to blow it up, and then starts stabbing people. And then you dig deep into it. Well, this guy, a couple years ago, had gotten radicalized. He believed this Islamist idea that ISIS was selling, that violence would somehow bring about the end of times, and we all need to come together to fight everybody who's not with us. It's that Khawarij ideology that I've spoken about before. Australia had picked this guy up, trying to smuggle himself into Syria to go do this, and they knew he had been radicalized, but they didn't think he was a physical threat. And that's what people are asking me about. Like, okay, I don't get it. This guy thought he was a perfect Muslim. He wanted to fly to Syria to join ISIS. And then they let him back out on the street. And then a couple years later, he blows up his car at an intersection and starts stabbing people. That's the connection that you have to explain. If you can't answer that question, then a non-Muslim just says, all right, well, you're not even trying, because I'm watching this. It's happening. It doesn't happen every day, and it's always overblown in the news. It's not the most popular crime. Plenty of people died in Chicago this year. I think it's up over 400 already. It has nothing to do with religion. It definitely has nothing to do with Islam. But if you can't explain why that guy did that in Australia, then you're not reaching the audience. So that's where I usually start off my discussion. Well, who the heck is ISIS, and where do these beliefs come from? Yes, they can dig into the Quran and find one or two passages that they will misuse to recruit people and convince young people that don't understand the Quran. You know what? The best way to get to heaven is to be violent and to kill somebody who doesn't believe in what you believe in, what we believe in. And they will explain to them that that's true Islam, because look, it's in the Quran. They won't tell them the backstory, that chapter in the Quran is all about a war between Muhammad and this new Muslim community and his cousins that live in Mecca, who are not Christians and Jews, they're pagans. And so the infidels in the story are not Christians or Jews, or Muslims of the wrong sect. They're pagan idol worshippers that are trying to kill Muhammad. It's a bloody and violent portion of the book, just like the Bible and the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and the Gospels. There's some violent stuff in there. But that's what ISIS will use. They'll just take that piece. They will not tell the young folks that later on, after there's a reconciliation process and a peace process, that God tells Muhammad one of the most courageous ways to act as a human being is to be patient and to forgive other people. The most way, not one of the most courageous way to act as a human is to be forgiving and patient. They don't talk about that in ISIS. And that's the disconnect that most Americans can't understand. Well, how can ISIS sell that message of violence so easily to these young people, some who are brand new converts, some who've been Muslims for a long time? How does that happen? And if you can't explain that, it's just simply, it's propaganda. You're taking a book and you're propagandizing it for exactly what you want. You're mobilizing people. And religion is a mobilizing tool. It's used all the time. Buddhists were just mobilized to kill the Rohingya in Myanmar. Christians have been mobilized by the Pope to go into the Holy Lands and fight Muslims to get control of Jerusalem. You can use religion to mobilize people. And that's the discussion I think you have to start with, because people do in their minds, especially after September 11th, have this belief that Islam must be a violent religion. There's no other way you could mobilize people to do that kind of extreme terrorist violence if the whole religion isn't violent. And you have to have that discussion about where do they get these ideas. How has that gotten worse since the 1970s? Who's pushing those ideas of violence instead of peace inside a religion? Because any religion can be pushed whichever way you want it. So I think that's
it's a small group cherry picking certain verses from the Quran to justify their actions that are extreme.
I think that's a perfect summary.
Yeah, that's
if
what
you
it
want
is.
to cherry pick, you can do that. It is too easy.
Right.
Why don't Muslims integrate into their new countries?
I get that one every meeting. Because most people, and these are American audiences, so most people in America, when they see Muslims in their community, they assume that they don't talk to non-Muslims, which if they have a job, they probably do. So if they go to school, they probably do. But when they see them, especially if they happen to be very conservative and the woman is covered, especially if she's covered in a burqa, or at least if her hair is covered very tightly, or there's very little skin showing, and the children are that way, or the men are wearing clothing from their home country instead of typical American Western looking clothes, or if the women are walking behind the men and the men are walking up front. All these things that in America we just can't get our head around, that culturally it's different. And so we assume, there's a big assumption in America that Muslims are not trying to integrate into their communities. And just like every community that's ever migrated to our country, you cluster around people you know. If you just got off of an airplane from Pakistan and you move to a community, all your friends are going to be Pakistani, because that's probably the people you moved there to go live near.
Right.
They're probably friends or family. They might be your cousins, it might be your in-laws, it could be your mom and dad, whoever. So you're going to stay around other people because that's the same food, it's the same clothing, it's the same language, it's all those things. But when we look at it for people who lived in America for decades or centuries even, and you see a new group like that, you go, well, why aren't they integrating? Look at them clustering amongst themselves. But that's where they are in their stage of immigration into this country. I mean, we're a nation of immigrants, but every generational migration into our country is very different, and they all face different hurdles. We definitely remember seeing the signs that said Irish need not apply for jobs during tough economic times. The Irish went through this, the Germans went through this, the Japanese clearly can tell people a lot about what it's like to integrate into society, having been locked up in World War II. It's just different.
You'll hear people sometimes say, if they're in our country, they should learn English. And, the angry, like, if they want to be here, they should X, Y, Z.
Yeah, I think people are always suspicious of new migrants and new immigrants, and you add on all the confusion about Islam, especially since September 11th. There's a fear, and I don't like the word Islamophobia, this idea that you're afraid of Muslims or you're afraid of Islam for no reason. There's a reason. I mean, I get that. There's a reason people are afraid of Muslims that come to their community and only hang around at their mosque, and their women are covered and they don't say hi to you on the street. There's a fear in that because everybody remembers September 11th, and you can't disconnect the two and say everybody should just get over it and ignore the fact that we don't talk to you on the street. You know what? If you're new to our country and you don't say hi to people on the street when they walk by, get it, New York City, nobody says hi, but especially if you live in a rural area and you don't say hi to people, that's suspicious. And so there's this natural suspicion, and I think it's warranted in some cases, that you know what? I just want to know what I feel like you're not integrating. Are you? And they're not having that discussion about, how can I help you integrate? They're just being, kind of angry about it. Well, they need to learn the language and start dressing like we do. Why they look like that? And I'm sure there are populations in America that aren't integrating well, Muslim, non-Muslim. There are some groups that stay together and are very cliquish, and they don't want to integrate very well. You can see it in D.C. There are little pockets all around D.C. I lived in a little Ethiopian and Eritrean area for a while, and they, every day all the taxi drivers would come into this little cafe to have their coffee and their pastries, and it was chocked full. I mean, when I walked in there, the record skipped. Who's this guy? He's not from our part of Africa wandering in here. I think we can see this in a lot of things, but you have to understand, I don't think people ask that question out of hatred. It's a suspicion born for half of it good ideas, and half of it, I just don't feel comfortable. And so maybe we need to talk more about that.
Right. And maybe take some of that responsibility. I'm uncomfortable because I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable about the culture. And so maybe if we did understand or learn a little bit more, or just say hello and kind of learn, it would seem a little less intimidating.
Yeah, I had that discussion once with a woman at one of my talks. She said, I pass these women all the time, and I worry that, maybe they have a bad home life. They never say hi to me. They're all covered. This is a very conservative Muslim neighborhood, and how do I make sure they're okay? So, well, okay, maybe there is something going on. That's a big assumption to make, but do you talk to them? Have you met any of them and started to introduce yourself and maybe go have coffee? And just human to human contact. That's how you're going to work it with anybody,
right.
Muslim or not. That's the only way you're going to get to know them and find out more about them. And that's you helping them integrate, because then they realize...
Right. It's like a team effort. It's really got to be a team effort.
You're not staring at them because of how they're dressed. You're staring at them because you want to know what's going on.
Right. If all you ever say to them is like, we want you to integrate, but we're just going to watch you do it. We're not going to be a part of the process. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, invite them to a meal or...
People hear what they hear on the news. They repeat it. And I feel like if they would even go just a little bit below the surface, they would start to understand what you're trying to do and what you're teaching people.
Yeah, I think some of these questions are they're just asking a question about a stereotype or a myth they've heard. If they took 2 seconds, they may have been able to look it up for themselves, open any book or a web page. But there's so much misinformation out there. I think they ask it because they know, what, this guy's been studying Islam for a couple of decades.
Sometimes it's nice to just ask and get
what
the
do you
real
think?
answer. Yeah.
And not that I'm perfect, and I may say things that are wrong or be misconstrued, but I think this is that chance. They feel like it's a moment to ask an honest question and really put to bed the myth or stereotype they've heard. And so I'm not going to assign names to the people who ask these questions, or even cities. I probably will put the state down where I got the question. But I think it's good to know that these questions come from all across the country. We need to have a better discussion about religion, especially Islam right now. There's still so much confusion, and that can lead to hatred. Although anti-Semitism is still the worst form of violence against religion going on in America today. There definitely, Islam and Muslims have felt the pain of people who take a myth or a stereotype too far, and they, instead of talking, they do something violent or stupid.
Another question you have on your list is, why are they building mosques everywhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very common. Why are they? That comes out right away.
Yeah.
Who are those others, and why are they building religious centers? So I lived in a lot of Baptist areas. We didn't say, hey, why are those Methodists trying to build a church over there? Because there's some Methodists who live there, and they want a place to worship. So if you turn that around, but to a lot of people, it's scary that, hey, I don't understand Islam, and now I didn't even know there were Muslims here. Now they're wanting to build a mosque. There's an assumption that someone's building a mosque to draw the Muslims to come live there, when in fact Muslims have probably lived there for decades, and they're tired of renting the basement at the Methodist church, and they want their own place to have a mosque so they can gather, because a lot of mosques are also community centers. They're after school programs, all the same things that churches do. They might run a school out of it. They use it for child care so that parents can go to work. There's a lot of things that happen at any religious center. But there is a big fear, and I think that drives that fear. Well, they're building one here in Tennessee because they want more Muslims to move here. Hey, the Muslims are already living there. It might have been your dentist that you've been seeing for 30 years, but you guys don't talk about religion. So, hey, he wants a place to worship too. so he can raise his kids instead of them, doing it at a rented property. And that was something I spoke with the president of the Islamic Society of North America, because that's one of the things they were doing in their founding. There's a lot of things that are known about that organization, and there's some negative things that people have found that they might have done. But one of the big things that they were doing was making sure that where there were a lot of Muslims living, they could stop, renting a facility and buy a facility and build a mosque and a religious center, so that they had a place to have community. And I think if you go back in time, I spoke with a gentleman the other night who's from South Carolina, who talked about this first Quaker home that was built in his little South Carolina town. It was a Quaker meeting place. It was one of the first ones built in his state. And he was telling me about the history that over the years, the Quakers left and moved to another place. But that building has been built upon and built upon and built upon. It's almost like every new religion that came to town used that space first. It burned down, they rebuilt it. They've always used that as some kind of religious place, and it's changed hands amongst different Christian denominations over the years. And that's really how a lot of mosques end up in America. They will use an old facility or a rented space. And what ISNA was trying to do, and what Dr. Saeed was really working on most of his time, was helping them figure out, okay, you want to turn that into a mosque? Let's figure out how to finance that. Let's get you a non-interest loan so that it's halal and we can do this right. Work with the community, talk to the other religions, and try to make this non-intrusive, but you need a place too, and stop, just renting an old apartment or some piece of a business building. But to most people, it can be very jarring. Oh my gosh, there's a minaret. There's just like a steeple would go up. Oh my gosh, now there's a minaret sticking up from this building. Yeah, that's how they look. Like that's how their religious centers have always looked. It's going to look that way. So I think that's an interesting conversation to have. That what came first, the chicken or the egg? Are they building a mosque to bring Muslims, or have Muslims always lived amongst you and they would like a place to worship too?
It's a good way to think about it. I mean, that's a good point that you're making. I think most people think if they build it, they will come. They're coming because a mosque is being built. When really, like you're saying, they've been in this community. Maybe it goes back to integration, and maybe we're not integrating with their community. We're not aware that all of these Muslims are within our community. They build a mosque and now we think they're all coming, when really they've been here for as long as you and I have been here.
Yeah. I mean, there's very old, we now know through genealogy that Muslims have been in America for a long, long time. I mean, Thomas Jefferson owned a Quran for a reason. That was an important part of his library. Not one of the best English editions that's out there. I wouldn't suggest that one, but, he had a Quran as a young guy living in America. So I think that's one we should be able to get through that pretty easily if we study how other religious organizations came to our community. So I'll guarantee your community started with one church, and then another group came in and they needed a church. And so you might even help them build the church. And now you're seeing that. I've noticed that some of the bridge building in America, you will see, Jewish groups help Muslims to build their mosque, or Muslim groups help to, repair a synagogue after it's been lit on fire, or people are now realizing, look, they're just trying to build a place to worship. There's probably nothing sinister to this, other than they would like their own building that meets the needs of their religion. And it's not to take over the county or to take over that side of the state. It's just a place to meet.
We are going to pause right there. There are so many questions we could continue to help answer. The hope is by answering some of these tough questions, we can help maybe dispel some myths or stereotypes and help you start or have a conversation about Islam in our country. As always, thanks for listening to We're Just Talking About It, and we'll see you on the next episode.